In this episode, we are stepping into a topic that sits very close to the heart of modern cybersecurity work, even though it is often misunderstood by beginners who hear the words and assume they mean the same thing. Evaluating threat and vulnerability management is really about asking whether an organization knows what could harm its systems, where its weaknesses are, and whether it is handling those realities in a disciplined and sensible way. A threat is something that could cause harm, such as an attacker, malicious software, insider misuse, or even a disruptive event that takes advantage of technical weakness. A vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited or triggered, such as outdated software, poor configuration, excessive access, or weak process design. When auditors study this area, they are not only looking for tools or scan reports. They are trying to understand whether information technology, IT, and security leadership have created a repeatable way to identify danger, recognize weakness, decide what matters most, and reduce exposure before small problems turn into incidents that damage operations, trust, or compliance. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong place to begin is by separating threats from vulnerabilities in a clear and practical way. A threat is the source of possible harm, while a vulnerability is the condition that allows that harm to succeed more easily. If someone leaves a window unlocked, the unlocked window is the vulnerability, and the burglar is the threat. In a technology environment, the same logic applies. An attacker may want to gain unauthorized access, but that goal becomes more realistic when weak passwords, missing updates, poor network segmentation, or unnecessary administrator privileges create openings. This distinction matters because organizations sometimes focus on one side while neglecting the other. They may talk constantly about attackers and current threat headlines without understanding their own weaknesses, or they may produce long vulnerability lists without considering whether those weaknesses are actually relevant to their environment and exposure. Good evaluation requires both views together. Auditors want to know whether the organization understands the relationship between what could attack the environment and what in the environment makes successful attack or disruption more likely. It also helps to understand why threat and vulnerability management matters so much in the first place. Organizations depend on technology for communication, finance, healthcare, logistics, customer service, identity management, and countless other functions that must remain dependable. When important weaknesses remain unaddressed, even ordinary business processes can be interrupted by events that should have been preventable or at least reduced in impact. A single vulnerable server, a poorly managed cloud setting, or a forgotten application can become the path through which an attacker reaches sensitive data or critical services. Threat and vulnerability management therefore supports more than technical hygiene. It supports business continuity, resilience, privacy, customer confidence, and leadership decision-making. For beginners, one of the most useful ways to think about it is this. The organization is trying to reduce the chance that a known weakness will be paired with a realistic threat in a way that causes harm. That is why this work is ongoing. New threats appear, environments change, and weaknesses are constantly created through growth, maintenance, and ordinary human decisions. A common misconception is that vulnerability management means simply running a scan from time to time and fixing whatever appears on a report. Scanning can be helpful, but it is only one part of the broader process. A mature program begins much earlier with understanding what systems, applications, devices, services, and data actually exist in the environment. If the organization does not know what it has, then it cannot assess those assets meaningfully for weakness or exposure. This is why asset awareness and inventory matter so much to auditing in this area. Unknown systems, forgotten software, unsupported applications, and temporary environments often become the most dangerous gaps because they fall outside the normal review cycle. Auditors evaluating threat and vulnerability management therefore look beyond the scan results themselves. They want to know whether the organization has enough visibility into its environment to apply the process consistently. A long report full of technical findings may look impressive, but if important assets are missing from review altogether, the program is weaker than it first appears. Another important point for new learners is that not every vulnerability carries the same level of concern. Some weaknesses are serious because they affect critical systems, are easy to exploit, and expose sensitive data or essential services. Others may be real but low impact because they exist on isolated systems, require unlikely conditions, or affect assets with very limited business importance. Threat and vulnerability management becomes much more effective when the organization can distinguish between these cases instead of treating every issue as equally urgent. This is where prioritization enters the picture. Auditors want to know whether management has a sensible way to decide what should be addressed first and why. That usually means considering the severity of the weakness, the importance of the affected asset, the presence of known threats, the degree of exposure, and the possible business impact. Weak programs often drown in volume because they collect findings without organizing them meaningfully. Stronger programs focus attention where the greatest practical risk exists, which helps the organization respond more intelligently rather than just more busily. Threat awareness is the other side of the equation, and it deserves just as much attention. An organization cannot prepare for every possible source of harm equally, so it needs some understanding of which threats are most relevant to its size, industry, technology stack, data sensitivity, and operating model. A healthcare provider may face different threat patterns than a manufacturer, and a cloud-heavy company may face different exposures than an organization centered on on-premises infrastructure. Threat awareness does not require dramatic forecasts or constant fear. It requires enough understanding of likely attack methods, adversary interests, internal misuse possibilities, and environmental dependencies that the organization can make grounded decisions about protection and prioritization. Auditors evaluate whether leadership and security teams use threat awareness meaningfully or whether they simply react to headlines. A healthy program does not chase every news story blindly. It asks whether a threat is relevant to the organization's actual environment and whether existing weaknesses make that threat more or less significant. That connection between context and action is one of the clearest signs of maturity. Identification of vulnerabilities can happen through several channels. And this is another area where beginners should think broadly rather than assuming one tool or method explains everything. Vulnerabilities may be found through automated scanning, configuration review, penetration testing, code review, patch assessment, incident investigation, vendor notifications, architecture review, audit work, or even ordinary support observations from technical staff. Some weaknesses are technical, such as missing updates or insecure settings. Others are process-related, such as weak approval paths, poor segregation of duties, or lack of review over privileged access. Still others are architectural, where the design of the environment creates exposure even if individual components are working as intended. Auditors study whether the organization relies too narrowly on one discovery method, because that can create blind spots. For example, a program that scans servers well but ignores cloud permissions, third-party dependencies, or important business applications may leave critical exposures untouched. Stronger programs use multiple ways of discovering weakness and then bring those findings into a process that can evaluate and act on them coherently. Remediation is where the program proves whether it is operationally real or merely informative. Finding a vulnerability is valuable, but only if the organization has a way to decide what action should follow and who is responsible for taking it. Sometimes the answer is patching, but not always. A vulnerability may be reduced through configuration change, network restriction, access control improvement, code correction, system replacement, process redesign, monitoring enhancement, or temporary compensating control while a permanent fix is being prepared. The important point is that remediation should match the actual weakness and the business conditions around it. Auditors examine whether responsibilities are clear, whether timelines are defined, whether high-risk findings move quickly enough, and whether unresolved items are visible to management rather than quietly aging without ownership. Weak programs often generate more findings than the organization can realistically handle, which leads to stale backlogs and a gradual loss of confidence. Stronger programs link discovery to accountable action, making it far more likely that serious weaknesses are reduced before they become the path to real harm. Patch management is often treated as the entire subject, but it is better understood as one important part of vulnerability reduction. Many serious weaknesses are corrected through updates, so patching remains essential. Yet even a good patch program cannot solve everything. Some assets cannot be patched quickly due to compatibility constraints, vendor limitations, operational timing, or legacy dependence. Some weaknesses arise from poor design rather than missing updates. Some risks come from default settings, unnecessary exposure, or weak access models. That is why auditors evaluate not only whether patches are applied, but also whether the organization understands where patching is enough and where additional control is needed. A mature environment usually shows awareness of unsupported systems, patch timing expectations, exception handling, and alternative safeguards when immediate correction is not possible. A weaker environment may assume that because patching exists somewhere, vulnerability management must be healthy overall. In reality, strong threat and vulnerability management requires the organization to deal honestly with the full range of weaknesses rather than hoping that one maintenance activity will cover every form of exposure. Compensating controls are especially important in real-world environments where immediate remediation is not always practical. A compensating control is a safeguard that reduces risk when the ideal fix cannot be applied right away. For example, if an old system cannot be patched quickly, the organization may reduce exposure by limiting access, isolating the system, increasing monitoring, restricting internet connectivity, or placing additional approval steps around its use. These measures do not erase the vulnerability, but they can lower the chance that the weakness will be exploited successfully while a longer-term solution is planned. Auditors pay close attention to this area because compensating controls can be responsible and necessary, but they can also become excuses for indefinite delay if not governed properly. A strong program documents why the primary fix is delayed, what compensating measures are in place, who approved the decision, how long the exception lasts, and what long-term plan exists. A weak program leaves unresolved vulnerabilities in place with vague promises and no meaningful reduction of the underlying exposure. Ownership and governance are another major part of evaluation because threat and vulnerability management rarely succeeds when it is treated as the security team's problem alone. Security functions may coordinate the process, interpret findings, and advise on priorities, but system owners, business leaders, infrastructure teams, application teams, and executives often hold responsibility for the assets and the decisions that determine how quickly risk is reduced. An auditor therefore looks for clarity around who owns findings, who approves exceptions, who decides on remediation timing, and who receives escalation when serious weaknesses remain unresolved. Without that structure, findings tend to circulate without real accountability. One team may assume another is fixing the issue, or business constraints may quietly override security concerns without proper documentation. Strong governance makes it easier to balance operational realities with risk reduction because the trade-offs become visible and owned. Weak governance produces the opposite effect, where the organization accumulates known weaknesses but cannot explain clearly why they remain or who accepted the risk. Measurement and reporting are also essential, but as with many audit topics, the quality of the measurement matters more than the number of charts produced. A healthy program usually tracks things like remediation timeliness, age of unresolved findings, concentration of weakness in specific systems or business units, exception volume, and recurring patterns that suggest deeper design or operational problems. These measures help leadership see whether the organization is actually reducing exposure or merely collecting information about it. Auditors want to know whether reporting supports decision-making rather than presenting a false sense of progress. For example, a high count of closed findings may sound good, but if the most critical vulnerabilities remain open month after month, the picture is not healthy. Likewise, low reported vulnerability counts may reflect weak discovery rather than strong control. Good reporting helps distinguish between noise and genuine risk reduction. It also helps management understand whether backlogs, ownership gaps, staffing constraints, or aging systems are preventing the program from working as intended across the whole environment. A useful example can make the topic more concrete. Imagine a financial services company that runs regular vulnerability scans and receives thousands of findings each month. On paper, The organization appears active because reports are generated and tickets are created. But a closer look shows that the same internet-facing systems keep appearing with serious weaknesses. Patch exceptions are approved repeatedly without strong review. Asset ownership is unclear for older applications, and teams focus mainly on easy fixes that improve dashboard numbers rather than on the exposures that matter most. In that situation, the organization has activity without real control. An auditor would not be satisfied by the existence of tools or reports alone. The deeper question would be whether the program meaningfully connects threat relevance, asset importance, prioritization, remediation, and governance. This example highlights one of the most important lessons for beginners. Threat and vulnerability management is not simply about finding technical flaws. It is about reducing the business's practical exposure through informed choices, accountable actions, and a process that keeps working even as the environment changes. There are also several common mistakes that auditors notice repeatedly in this area. One is focusing only on technical severity while ignoring business context, which can cause the organization to spend too much time on lower-value issues while critical exposures wait. Another is relying too heavily on one discovery method, such as automated scanning, while missing weaknesses in design, identity, cloud use, or business processes. Some organizations also fail because they do not manage exceptions carefully, allowing temporary delays to become permanent patterns. Others struggle because they treat vulnerability management as a monthly reporting exercise instead of a living process connected to change, operations, asset management, and risk governance. There is also a frequent misconception that the absence of known incidents means the program is working well. In reality, an organization may simply be fortunate for a time or unaware of how close its weaknesses are to being exploited. Good evaluation requires asking whether the process is strong enough to reduce risk deliberately, not just whether disaster has not yet occurred. From an audit perspective, evaluating threat and vulnerability management means gathering evidence that the organization understands its environment, identifies weakness through multiple relevant channels, prioritizes intelligently, assigns ownership clearly, and follows through with meaningful remediation or justified compensating control. The auditor may review inventories, scan coverage, remediation records, exception approvals, governance materials, ownership mappings, reporting trends, and interviews with technical and business stakeholders. The goal is not to demand a perfect environment with zero vulnerabilities, because no real organization operates that way. The goal is to determine whether the organization knows where its important weaknesses are, understands the threats that matter most, and has a disciplined process for reducing exposure over time. A mature program usually shows visibility, context, accountability, and action. A weaker program usually shows disconnected findings, unclear ownership, stale backlogs, and a heavy focus on technical activity without enough evidence that actual business risk is being brought down. As we close, the big idea to carry forward is that evaluating threat and vulnerability management is really about asking whether the organization can see danger and weakness clearly enough to act before harm becomes reality. Threats represent what may exploit or disrupt the environment, while vulnerabilities represent the weaknesses that make success easier for those threats. Good management brings those two views together and turns them into prioritization, remediation, governance, and ongoing learning. When this area is strong, the organization is better able to protect critical systems, reduce preventable exposure, and make realistic decisions about where attention belongs. When it is weak, the business may have many reports and many tools, yet still remain dangerously open because known weaknesses are not being handled in a disciplined way. For a new learner, that is the point worth remembering most. The purpose of threat and vulnerability management is not to create endless lists of problems. It is to reduce the chance that the wrong weakness and the wrong threat will meet in a way the organization could and should have prevented.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.